Okay, so we're continuing on here with example 10. So again, we have to get rid of the root in the bottom, but whenever there is a plus or minus, the only way to do it is by multiplying by the opposite, which is it's in this words, it's called, it starts with the C if you look back, it's called the conjugate. So what is the conjugate on this problem? Very good. 9 plus root 2. And whatever you do to the bottom, you also need to do to the top. Because basically, that would cancel out and make what? These two cancel out and make what? 1. So when you're multiplying by 1, all we're doing is like changing the form of this problem, okay? To get rid of that root in the denominator. Okay, do you guys want to do the box on this? Or, since it's a difference of squares, what would it end up being? (81 minus 2). Because root 2 and root 2 would be 2. And then a negative times a positive is a negative. If you do the box, you should end up getting the same thing. Okay, and so now we have 81 minus 2, which makes 79. Okay, and on the top, we're going to distribute. Root 3 times 9 makes 9 root 3. And root 3 times root 2 makes positive root 6. And can I reduce anything or pull anything out? No. Good. So that is my answer.
Wait, 9 root 3 plus root 6?
See how it's like a root 3 and a root 6? You can't add them together. They both need to be root 3s or both need to be root 6s.
But because root 6 can be, like, 3 can go into 6, so is there a way we could reduce that?
No, it'd only be if the root 6 or the root 3 was on the bottom. If one was on the bottom and one was on the top. Yes?
How'd you get the root 3 plus root 6?
We took this root 3 right here, and we multiplied root 3 times 9, which makes 9 root 3. And root 3 and root 2. See how the 9 is not in a root? It has to stay on the...
Okay, makes sense now. Thank you.
You're welcome. So roots, you multiply them, it goes inside. Okay, so that's it. That's your answer. We can't reduce anything or whatever. So that's it. Okay. All right, next one. It says examples solving quadratic equations by using square roots. Okay, one thing that you need to remember is that when you're solving using square roots, anytime you make a square root, your answer will always be plus or minus. Okay. So, because I'm going to show you 2 ways of solving this one. Okay, so the first thing you want to do, just here's a couple steps, is get the square by itself. So that's step 1. Step 2, take the square root of both sides. And then the third thing is that anytime you take the square root, the answer is plus or minus. So on 11 is the square by itself. So we take the square root of both sides. And what's the square root of x squared? X. And what's the square root of 49?
7.
So it's going to be plus or minus 7 is our answer. Now, just to show you how we're getting this, remember how last unit we had to make everything set equal to 0 and then we factored? So if I subtracted 49 and I got x squared minus 49 equals 0, and then I factor difference of squares, x minus 7 times x plus 7 equals 0. And then we set each of those factors equal to 0, and I got x equals 7 and x equals negative 7. So, do you see how we got the same answer? Do you see how this one's a lot less work? So, when we're dealing with squares like this and there's no middle numbers, we don't, okay, basically it ended up being a difference of squares. This way is much easier. And that's what we're doing right now. Okay, so what are we going to do on 12? Same thing. The square is by itself. We take the square root of both sides. The square root of w squared is w equals, the thing that you have to remember is that, see how I personally made those square roots? My answer is plus or minus. If the square roots are already there, like how back in these problems that we were doing, these answers are not plus or minus because the root's already there. We didn't make that root. So it's just the answer. But on these questions, I'm making the square root, so it's going to be plus or minus. Okay? Now, 84, does that break down?
No. 2 root 21.
Okay, so 84, if we break that down, that is 42 times 2. And then 42 breaks down to, okay, we can do 7 and 6. And then 6 is, okay, so we have a pair of 2's, and there's a 7 left over and a 3 left over. So how do I write that answer? Plus or minus 2 root 21. So the one thing that people often forget, what do you think people forget? Plus or minus. So be really careful of that. Okay, on 13, the square is not by itself. So we have to get the square by itself. But what do you think we should do before that? We can get rid of the fractions. Who knows how I get rid of the fractions? Multiply by 20. Multiply by your common denominator number. In this case, it would be 20. So I'm multiplying by 20 to every term. So on the first one, the 20's cancel, and I get t squared plus, what is 20 times 8? 160 equals, and 20 times 15 is 300. Okay? Is my square by itself? No, so what do I do now? Okay? So we subtract 160 to both sides. These cancel. T squared equals, and 300 minus 160 is 140. Good. Then at this point, we now what? We take the square root of both sides. Anytime I make the square root, my answer is going to be plus or minus. Okay? 140. How do we want to break that down? Okay, so there's a lot of different ways. I'm going to go 14 and 10. You can do whatever you want, though. It will all work out the same. 14 is 7 and 2, and 10 is 2 and 5. So I have a pair of 2's, and I have a 7 and a 5 left over. So my answer will be t equals plus or minus 2 root 35 is correct. Questions? All right. Okay. So on 14, is the square by itself? Yes. Okay. See how the parentheses is squared? There's nothing else with that square. Okay. So when I take the square root of both sides, I end up getting what? X minus 3 equals plus or minus 5. What do you think we have to do now? Solve it. So we're going to set up two equations. I'm going to set this up as x minus 3 equals 5 and x minus 3 equals negative 5. And I'm going to get two answers. Here I add 3 and we get x equals 8. Here I add 3 and I get x equals negative 2. So my answers are x equals 8 and negative 2. Questions? Okay, number 15. Is my square by itself? No. What do you think we need to do first? No. Add 18. First add 18. So we do that. I get 7 parentheses x plus 4 squared equals 28. Now what do I do? Good. Now we can divide by 7. We have x plus 4 squared equals 4. And then lastly, what will I do? Very good. Take the square root of both sides, which will give me x plus 4 equals plus or minus 2. And then you can make your two equations. X plus 4 equals 2 and x plus 4 equals negative 2. So here when we solve, we subtract 4. X equals negative 2. Here we subtract 4 and we get x equals negative 6. Good. So my answers are x equals negative 2 and negative 6. Okay. We're ready for 16? All right. Is the square by itself? Yes. So what am I going to do? Square it both sides. So I get x minus 9 equals, and what's the square root of 24? Good. It doesn't make an even number, right? So we break it down, and I have 6 and 4, and then I have a 2 and a 2. And I'm not going to break down the 6 because I'm not going to have another pair. Did you have a question, Michael?
No.
Okay. So then that ends up making plus or minus 2 root 6. Now, we can't add whole numbers and roots together. So instead of breaking this into two different equations, which you could, but it's easier to just go ahead and add 9 like this to both sides. And then my answer will be x equals 9 plus or minus 2 root 6. So one answer is 9 plus 2 root 6, and the other one is 9 minus 2 root 6. But you can leave your answer just like that. So on the other ones where they are whole numbers, I could actually add and subtract the numbers and simplify. This one we won't be able to simplify, so we can just leave it as plus or minus. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. Do we have any questions?